Welcome to Stories That Stick with me, Laura, as your resident storyteller. I'm here to show you how oral stories inspire and captivate minds young and old. Tune in each week to hear a compelling story and join in meaningful conversations. I'll be digging deep into the heart of storytelling, connection, and listening. So whether you're a kid, teacher, caregiver, grandparent, or simply a lover of stories, this podcast is for you. Join me as you get lost in another world and discover how stories shape our lives. Here's to the next page in our story. Welcome. I am super excited for today's episode. I have here one of my mentors that taught me almost everything I know about storytelling and story acting. And I'm going to let him introduce himself and tell you a little about himself. This is Dr. Ben Mardell. And I'd love you to tell us who you are and what you're doing right now.
Well, it's really nice to be talking to you about storytelling, story acting, something we both really care deeply about. I think because we see how excited kids are when they're doing it and how much they're learning. So currently I'm the Atelierista and Pedagogista at the Newtown School, which is in Harvard Square in Cambridge. And that means that I'm the studio teacher. So I take small groups of kids throughout the school into the studio for playful small group activities that often include storytelling and story acting. And then as the pedagogista, I consult with my colleagues and help with our ongoing emergent curriculum. But I've done a lot of other things in early childhood before that. I've been in the field more than 40 years. I've taught infants, toddlers, preschoolers, and kindergartners. I've been a teacher educator at Lesley University, a researcher at Project Zero, but it's always been focused on thinking about, how can we make kids empowered and empowered not just as individuals but as members of a group, as a collective.
I love thinking about that, right? I so often talk with my children and other adults in my world about that shift in my parenting style from being the one that holds so much power and how much we can, use or abuse that power. And for me, a lot of the ways that I shift what I've, kind of grown up and learned is by talking about it. So I talk with my kids. There's often times where I'll do or say something where I'm like, oh, I was just like really using my power to decide what needed to happen. And I think it's really easy for us as adults to forget what it felt like to be a child and how little power we actually, had, especially depending on the setting that we were in, whatever the environment was or the adults that were around us at the time. So I think that that's a really beautiful way to think about it.
And I think that one mistake I think a lot of adults and sometimes teachers make is thinking of power as a zero-sum game. Like if you give power to kids, then you lose power. But you actually, if you give power to kids, empower them, make them capable, if you're thinking about a classroom or a family, the family can somehow become more powerful. It's not that you're giving up, losing your power, but you're making the whole more powerful. So that's something I think educators need to keep in mind. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Because it is really easy, I think, especially in the early childhood world, many of us are constantly advocating that what needs to be happening is child-led learning. And many people, depending on the districts that they're in or the type of environment they're in, are coming against a lot of blocks and roadblocks where the adult is directing the learning. And then the perception becomes, well, if it's child-led, or if you're giving that power to the children to decide what they're interested in, what they want to learn, that it in some way becomes this free-for-all, right? And that it's complete chaos. There are no rules, and it's bananas, which we know, in fact, when children are given the trust and the power and they see that we believe in them and follow their lead, then that's where that magic really does happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm sure you've seen that in so many different ways, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because you've done so much of that project-based learning, which is what that's all about. Yeah. So I know you just did your big project with on the pedagogy of play, right?
Yes.
Do you want to tell a little bit about that?
So the Pedagogy of Play was a collaboration between Project Zero, which is a research group at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Lego Foundation, thinking about how to bring more play and playful learning into schools, both in early childhood, but in elementary and middle and high school as well. So really thinking about, well, articulating why playful learning is important. What are the affordances of play and connected to learning that make it a valuable thing to have in schools? What it looks like in different cultural settings, because while play and playful learning, there's some universal aspects, it's also culturally situated. And with play, it's like when you play, how you play, what you play with, who you play with. If you're supposed to stop playing at a certain age, are all part of the culture that you're in. And
Mm.
so thinking about the cultural dynamics of playful learning. And then thinking about how teachers and school leaders can be the principal, but I think teachers also can think of themselves in that role. What can, what are some practices that educators can do to support building a culture in classrooms and schools that are around playful learning? And those are the three questions. I'm happy to say that we decided to self-publish our book instead of going with the publisher. So I can now say, I can say the statement that if you go to the Pedagogy of Play webpage on the Project Zero website, you can download the PDF of the book for free. You can download a Spanish version, or you can download a Chinese version. So that's really good. And the book answers these three questions. And really, I think a lot of people find chapter on practices that go really into the weeds of what teachers can do very valuable. So,
Yeah, I think that resource is amazing. When I saw that you could grab it as a free PDF, I was like, this is brilliant. And the website is so well put together. And when I saw it had other versions, and I think there's also like almost a workbook that accompanies it as well to help educators, or I don't know who else would read it besides educators, but that helps educators probably unpack some biases or things that they need to unlearn or rethink, which is awesome. That was really exciting in like the little play-based world for me, I know, and a lot of other people that I know. We were really excited when that came out because
here.
we know, right? And so often we just keep coming across the things that are stopping play from happening. And I agree, it doesn't stop just when a kid turns 5 or 6. So
Yeah.
important for children to have access to free play for forever. Yeah. So I'd love to hear kind of some of your thoughts on how storytelling is play.
Well, first, a lot of play is connected to narrative, and, and kids will spin out dramas. They'll either individually with puppets or stuffed animals, but often with other kids, and sometimes with older caregivers as well. They love telling tales. It starts developing, starting at 2 and 3. By 5 and 6, Paley talked about kindergarten as being the height of dramatic play. The kids are players at that age, but they continue to love to do that first and second grade, and even beyond that as well. And so the idea that we're telling a story or creating a story is very playful. That kids have the agency that an element of play that they get. And Paley sometimes had, she would call them, there may be conventions or rules of social conventions that each classroom has about what is acceptable. There may be some things out of bounds. And I think for her, it was private family matters. She didn't want kids to be, she would caution kids to have that in their story. But otherwise, pretty much kids can tell what kind of story they want about who, and they can take the story in the direction that they want. There's not a set script. They're in charge. And then the acting out is play that they're involved with, and figuring out that dynamic. So both the telling, but then the story acting component as well allows for that. And it, I guess part of this thing about that play can be joyful, not, it's fun, but it's also this, when kids really come together and make a story, a successful story acting episode, there is a certain feeling of accomplishment that they know that just that was good.
Yeah,
It felt good to do that together, and that's also an element of play as well. So
yeah, absolutely. That actually, when I just had a memory, I've spoken with Trisha Lee a lot,
yeah.
and we've talked about how different it would be in this day and age, post COVID, when children were learning virtually, and how different it would be. I mean, I'm sure you remember when we did the story acting session with her children in the UK, and we
Yes.
had the projectors, and, we were using Skype and, none of the technology that we have now, and children, very unfamiliar. They didn't have FaceTime or things like that, but how well they still like pass the treasure through the
Good.
camera, right? And we all felt like as adults, like that it happened. Like, look
Yeah.
at that. They cross interacted digitally. And we just laugh about, wow, we put kids, on a screen now. They would like they wouldn't even need us. They'd be just telling and acting out stories like we know how to do this all the time.
Yeah, that was a magical moment from Boston to London.
Yeah, it
Um,
really was. It was so cool.
I think that was that episode too. I remember thinking in your classroom, the kids were very open to being any kind of characters. Like boys, weren't hung up about being a female character, and vice versa. But the one thing that they were very reluctant was, I think there was a story about the Boston Red Sox playing the New York Yankees, and nobody wanted to be a New York Yankee in your class.
That sounds right. I mean, when we're in Boston, I could see how there might have been some, stink eyes from their family at home.
But
But absolutely, I think one of the things that you and I both have seen with storytelling and story acting, that one of the like key aspects that isn't always highlighted, of course, they're learning literacy skills and they're learning social skills, but that sense of community
mhm,
that happens and the way that children start to, be inspired by one another's stories
mhm,
and start to include maybe characters that others like or are interested in so that they are including them in their narratives, and the way that all the stories become this living, breathing body throughout the time that those children are doing this.
mhm,
And seeing that time and time again was always the most magical for
uh-huh.
me because, like you said, they had agency, they had the ability to choose where it went, right? Who were going to become the characters that always showed up, or what was the storyline that was constantly going to be, acted out.
Mm.
And that's such a beautiful thing to see. I love that.
Yeah, just the sense of this is the way that we in our class pretend to be a house, right?
Hmm.
Different ways that you can do that, but there's that's something that we as a group figured out and feel really good about. So
Right. And that probably there's this, unless they're seeing other, other people acting out or things, that probably sometimes those moments of like, well, no, that's not how you act out a house. Like it's clearly you bend over and you have 2 feet and 2 hands on the ground. This is the way, right? Where some other children might do it in a different way. And that was the thing that I learned so much from Trisha Lee, was like sitting on your hands and making sure you weren't modeling any of those kind of actions, because as
right,
adults, it's so easy for us to want to maybe move, especially at the beginning, the story acting along,
right.
or, solve that issue when it's, a tree or a vehicle or whatever it might be, and give those suggestions. But as much as we can as the educators, if we just slow down and allow the children to, pause the story and negotiate while they're on the stage what it might look like to have the different characters being different things. That's really, I mean, so yeah.
Yeah, or even or just giving again the power to the kids. So what's happening a lot, the youngest group at Newtown, I'm doing a bunch of storytelling in conjunction with teachers, and after each episode, we often have a conversation, and some of it is like, last week, one of the kids said, well, I asked, what other characters could we have in stories? And somebody suggested a rainbow. So then the question became, how do you act out a rainbow? And it wasn't that I would then say, you act out of the, what you just said. That would be thinking I need to hold the power, but it would be, so Timon, how would you do that? Oh, that's kind of cool. Well, Nora, do you have another idea? Oh, well, that's kind of interesting. And what do you think, Finlay? And so the kids are just, even though some of them haven't turned 3 yet, they're really invested in the conversation, and they have some really good ideas, and the ideas that, that work for them.
That's so awesome. I love that. I think that was a big takeaway for me as well that I started to learn when we were doing our Boston Listen, because we were learning how to do storytelling and story acting, and we were having these professional development seminars. So it was forcing us to really dig deep into what the children were doing, but also what were we as educators doing, and trying to figure out, like, it can't be this simple. It can't just be 10 minutes of like writing a story and acting it out. There has to be more. But in looking back, I was like, oh my goodness, this is the easiest thing to do that takes the smallest amount of time. It's such a big bang for your buck. But I remember, learning that sometimes just having those conversations right after, right? And commenting on, yeah, how awesome they navigated around the space together, or being like, yeah, we've been telling a lot of stories about X. What
Yes.
else could we include in these? Or I've noticed when you're playing outside, you're, pretending to be such and such. Like, would you want to include that into your stories? And how just having conversations with the kids, yeah, I mean, they want to talk about it. And it just sparks all those different ideas. So
Yeah,
you're doing it with kids that are like 2s and 3s, right?
exactly.
And
Yeah.
what age does the Newtown School go up to?
So we go up to, there's 4 age-based classrooms, and kid can be like 1, 9 in September to 5. And now, the oldest are 5.5, and the youngest are like 2.5. But it just kind of spontaneously happened with the youngest kids starting doing storytelling, story acting, and then the next oldest class we do it a lot as well. And it's with the next oldest class, Purple Fish, it was, there was, even in the last couple sessions, there's been a shift in terms of the understanding of stories and the acting, and they always enjoy doing it, but kind of the routine has been very important. And then the idea of, well, going around, well, I want to be the mom. Well, but there's no mom in the story. So, but so when you tell your story, you can include a mom. And oh, okay.
Right. And now I'm going to hold that in my mind till I can tell a story, and I'm going to include a mom. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So
that's beautiful. Now I'm curious, are you telling stories with them?
yes, so I also tell stories, and I think my mouse puppet Enlin. And so something that I've found early on in teaching is that it's forming relationships with young children who sometimes can be shy around unfamiliar adults. Kids will interact with my puppet before they interact with me. And so Enlin was especially important early on, and introducing me to, because it's my first year at Newtown. And
Mhm.
Newtown Enlin is extremely popular. She's a rock star at the school. She gets mail, she gets presents. They've decided that her favorite cheese is smoked Gouda cheese. And one of the kids made her a little lunchbox, because, of course, she's at school during lunch, so she has to have lunch. And inside was some pretend smoked Gouda cheese. And so Enlin there's some stories that Enlin is involved with, like the classic loudmouse, but there's also other stories. And it's again, it's just a really nice way to connect and with kids, and form bonds, and they know that there's some favorite stories that I can share with them, and that's something that we enjoy together. So
I love that. So have you always kind of thought of yourself as a storyteller? Were
Absolutely
you
not.
always telling story when you were younger children? Like what happened that
So have this. I'm glad you asked that because it brings up an old memory, but it's a nice memory. It was 1984, so that was a while ago. I was substitute teaching at my friend Ann Kornblatt's Head Start classroom in Alston, Brighton, and we would Ann and I would trade off doing the meeting time,
Mhm.
and in the planning for this particular meeting, the teacher was supposed to um, model a story box that had a variety of props that was then going to be at a table that kids can use to tell stories. And looking back on it, they maybe weren't the most inspiring props, but there was like a hole punch and a stapler and anyways, I took them. I wasn't the most intentional teacher at that point. I had kind of just fallen into teaching it. I'd only been doing it a year or so. So I had the story box in front of me and I just was totally ad-libbing it. And it was a really horrible story looking back on it. It was hole punch was chasing the stapler and then the stapler was running away and then I could like I was talking and I was getting into it though, and then I like stopped for a second and I looked and the 18 kids were all staring at me. They were totally engrossed and I have to say before that the meeting times were the least favorite part because I didn't know how to do it very well. And so there was always like a lot of management issues because actually the meetings weren't all that compelling of
right?
what I was doing. But here it was like, whoa, there is something here. And that's when I started then thinking about storytelling. I went to some storytelling workshops and got, there's still some stories that I tell to this day that I forget the name of the storyteller who taught the workshop, but she, she taught me some really nice tales that kids continue to enjoy. And then I encountered the work of Vivian Paley and learned about the storytelling, story acting practice, and then often running with that as well. So,
Oh, that's so interesting. I mean, it really is, one of the things that I have always found, and it's like you said, right? You're like, this was a really horrible story. And I was using a hole punch and a stapler. But it's not always the storytelling is not always as much about the content of it as this like bonding moment and the level of engagement that I always see from children. And one of the things that I notice for myself when I'm telling stories is I have to be like 100% present. Especially if I'm making up a story, I
right.
can't be thinking about what I'm going to grocery shop for. I can't be thinking about when the kids have to line up for lunch. I can't be thinking about anything else because
Mhm.
I forget the character. I don't know where it's going to go. And I am like 100% present. And I imagine children pick up on that when we
Mhm.
are 100% present and when we are kind of our minds a little bit somewhere else and
Yeah.
we're there with them. And I
Mhm.
think that storytelling is one of those times, especially if we as adults are telling stories, we are doing something that comes so easily to them that they are doing in their play all the time. And, telling silly things that would never happen. How often do they hear an adult telling about a stapler chasing a hole? Never, right? So it's that like comedy and this like, what is this adult doing that they're like playing on our level?
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
I feel like it's that window where, we are playing ourselves and
Yes.
inviting the children in to see it. Whereas normally we're watching and noticing their play and then maybe they invite us into it. But those moments where we are telling stories, especially if it's a story we love or we get really into it, that they see that, they authentically see that. And that's where that level of engagement, I think, can really come in for the adult and the child.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that I haven't told that story about the hole punch and the stapler in a while, but when I with, had been doing storytelling, story acting workshops and talking about the importance of adults sharing stories as models, as ways of connecting, building community, I felt was a useful story because it's like, you know, you don't have to be great to start. and you kind of just have to start. And the audience, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 year old audience, is a really forgiving audience. They're just going to appreciate that you're giving it a try, and they're going to be with you. And so, and then obviously, just like we tell kids, you get better by practicing and trying and making mistakes and being inspired by other people. And there's so many good stories out there. And it's a way um, to kids love stories about your cat or about your kid or about
Mhm.
when you were a kid or going to school. There's so much material you can draw on personally, but also stories about your community, from your community. So, and just, on the web now, like I was just going back, years ago, there was a wonderful storyteller in Boston named J. O'Callahan. Um, and I was just found some of his stories that I used to love when I was, 20, 30 years ago. But I think that's just, I named him not because you should do J. O'Callahan, but there's just a lot of good stories out there that then you can listen to, you can attribute. But that's the thing about storytellers, is that it's an oral tradition. It gets passed down. There's nothing more complimentary than somebody taking your story and telling it to another group of kids. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, did you hear Loudmouth from somebody else, or was that one you made up your own?
that's one
Yeah.
of that's one of those story workshops when I was a novice teacher, and was trying to get some stories, and the workshop leader told the story, and she had some very good advice. At first, she had us turn and tell the story to the person next to us and vice versa. But then she said, go home and tell it to your housemate. You tell it one more time, you're going to remember it. Then on Monday, when you're back with kids, tell it again. And then, then you have a new story as part of your repertoire. So,
Yep. I mean, I remember that sage advice because that when you told us, Loudmouth Club was when we did Boston Listens, part of that was teaching us stories and exposing us to stories. And I remember you shared that it was like once you told a story 3 times, you will know it. And
mhm.
so when I tell a story, because I tell stories most nights to my children, when I tell one and I'm like, oh, that was a good one. Like sometimes, and look, children audiences, like when they're not your own kids, are super forgiving. Your own kids, they're not forgiving at all. My dad will straight up be like, that was not a good story. You need to tell a better one. Try again. But if I tell one and I'm like, ooh, I'll go right into my room and try to write it down, or I'll tell it again on a voice note so I can remember it and then tell it to them again the next day. And then usually it is there. But it's so interesting. I remember you sharing that advice with us. Like if you tell a story multiple times, you're gonna tell it like 3 times, and then you'll just start adding it into your repertoire. Yeah, that's awesome. Um, so I would love, I know you were talking just a little bit before about your current research now, and I'd love to hear a little bit about it and or
Oh, yeah.
um of course, as we were just sharing that, I was thinking about ways you could incorporate stories in with it as well.
Yeah. So I'm really, well, I think like many people, I'm concerned about the many different environmental crises we have, and thinking about what this means. What are the implications for early childhood educators? Knowing that the kids that we're teaching, we don't know exactly what the world will be like when they're adults, but we know that it's going to be different, and it's very likely going to be more turbulent. That the climate is going to become more problematic, and that's going to cause more social and political uncertainty and unrest. And so as part of, that's what I'm thinking about, what as early childhood educators we need to be doing in order to prepare our kids for this future. And I guess I'm thinking two broad things. One is the project that work that you talked about, involving and engaging kids in projects that involve the whole school community, because that project work, um, by taking kids' ideas seriously, fosters agency, it fosters collaboration, creativity, and just and adaptability. That that kind of curriculum, you don't actually, nobody knows where it's exactly going to go. just like the real world. So I think that there's a Dave Perkins, who was one of the key people at Project Zero, likes to talk about how, you know, classrooms are really pretty tame in a lot of ways, while the world out there is pretty wild. Um, and it's not that the classroom should be completely wild, because as educators, we need to kind of help kids process and make sense. But if a classroom is too tame, if you know, and sadly, a lot of classrooms kind of know what's going to be happening in day one and what's going to be happening in day 180. And actually, some classrooms know what's going to be happening at noon on day 65. And the principal will pissed off. You're Cage of the Massacre film. That's way too tame. Project work is a way to make it a little bit wilder, because it allows for kids' input and their interests, and takes it in different directions. And so project work is one of the things I'm thinking about. And the second thing, just so I won't ramble on too much,
No, please.
is kids' relationships with the natural world. And helping them, especially because we're in the middle of a city, where some people would say, oh, there's no nature. Well, there's actually a lot of critters that live around us, and that, but I think that not everyone, but a lot of Cambridge residents kind of don't pay attention and don't take into account those critters when making decisions about our city. And I think that it seems clear that that kind of like lack of thinking about the natural world is ultimately not sustainable for human beings as well. That we're part of the system, and if we don't take into account the trees and the animals and the ecosystem in the long term, that's not great for human beings. And so helping kids become more aware and feel a part that these trees and squirrels and birds and bugs we're a part of a larger system. We're actually these are maybe going too far to say fellow citizens, but fellow co-inhabitants of the city that we need to have some regard to. Now it's complicated because we're not telling kids not to swat a mosquito, but I am wanting them to be aware, to be curious about, to enjoy, and then ultimately to think about, when they are adults, and like to think about how to create a city that works for human beings, but also for the other critters that are co-inhabiting the city.
And unfortunately, just after Ben was sharing about his research, I had my first tech issue. My Wi-Fi cut out towards the end of this interview. And so I thank you for joining, and sorry you didn't get to hear the last bit of our conversation, but I hope this was insightful and helpful for you.
The end. But really, that's it for today's episode of Stories That Stick. Inspiring and captivating minds young and old. Remember, stories have the incredible ability to spark conversations, ignite imagination, and create lasting connections. If you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a 5-star review. It really does make a difference. And if you have a story to share or a topic you want me to explore, reach out to me on Instagram at Little Stories That Stick. Until next time, keep working that storytelling muscle and tell stories every day.